When people talk about what was happening with Johnson, why the sudden switch when he seemed so promising, it's really hard to say. Uh, my feeling is that he really identified with the South ultimately, that he felt uncomfortable with the Northern radical Republicans, that he was a contentious figure and he kind of enjoyed contention. And what everyone else says is that he was racist and that his racism was guiding his policy.
This is Professor Robert Levine on why Andrew Johnson went from being a supporter of Black Americans to the radical Republicans' worst enemy. This is Henry Wilson and the Civil War. As the nation was in the process of being restored in the early days of 1866, Wilson strove to enhance the quality of life and ensure that the rights that were owed to newly freed Black Americans in the South were protected. As the Freedmen's Bureau's discontinuation was quickly approaching following President Johnson's veto, laws suppressing and extinguishing Black Americans' rights to fair trials, to vote, and hold political office began to spring up across the South. South Carolina, a state that refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, passed a law that established a system for what many claimed was a renewed form of slavery. These unjust laws were termed Black Codes, as they were laws that applied only to suppress the Black inhabitants of these states. Upon learning about the introduction of Black Codes throughout the South, Wilson took action, writing a letter to Secretary of State Seward urging the Johnson administration to do more, writing, quote, "Do in God's name stop all this legislation. Say to the states that the slaves are citizens and that they are under the same laws as white people, and that they have no right to pass any law in regard to the freedmen that does not apply to their white, non-voting people. If the administration does not do it, Congress will pass such an act. You at Washington, I hope you will lead in this matter. Do I pray you act at once." End quote. Seward forwarded the letter to President Johnson, who took no action. While Wilson was passionate about enfranchising Black voters, he believed that halting Black Codes was top priority, even more than reunifying the states. Writing in a follow-up letter to Seward, Wilson wrote, quote, "At the opening of Congress, the question not of Negro suffrage will be an issue, but the amendment of all laws against the freedmen in their full liberty will be pressed." End quote. When Congress opened in December 1865, Wilson did just that and introduced a bill that would stop all Black Codes in their tracks. Despite having one of the most radical voting records in the Senate when it came to racial equality, in attempting to get the bill passed, Wilson restrained his radicalism and made pleas to his moderate colleagues, saying, quote, "Whatever differences of opinion may exist in regard to the right of suffrage, I'm sure that there can be no difference of opinion among honest and just men in regard to maintaining the civil rights and immunities of these freedmen. They should stand at any rate like the non-voting white population of those states." End quote. In the same speech, Wilson quipped in a response to those who charged him with being too radical, quote, "I have always noticed that when I heard a man prate about being conservative and about conservatism, he was about to do some mean things. I never knew it to fail. In fact, it is about the first word a man utters when he begins to retreat." End quote. Rising from his early days in the Natick Debating Club, speaking with an impediment and often being mocked for being ineloquent, throughout his career, Wilson became a somewhat refined and highly sought orator. Though Wilson had worked hard to sway his colleagues, the bill failed, its opponents arguing that the 13th Amendment would take care of these laws. As Wilson worked to fight for the rights of the newly freed, he simultaneously fought for the freedom of imprisoned Confederates. When it came to punishing those who had rebelled against the Union, Wilson held a forgiving attitude. Throughout 1865 and 1866, Wilson became one of the only radical Republican advocates for the release of many of the rebel enemies that had been arrested following Union victory. Wilson was especially concerned with the treatment and release of his former colleague and friend, Jefferson Davis. Wilson corresponded with President Johnson to improve the conditions of prisoners, a notion the president was not fond of early in his term. Despite being a moderate when it came to race, Johnson was a strong proponent of punishing his fellow Southerners who rebelled against the Union. Over the course of many months, Wilson met with Jefferson Davis and pushed for his release. The release of Davis was unpopular in the North, though Wilson and others felt it would be a good step in the right direction of unifying the nation. Davis was released on bail in May 1867, before fleeing to Canada. In the closing hours of his presidency in 1868, Johnson pardoned all former Confederates who were still being prosecuted, thereby freeing Davis from any further prosecution. Following President Johnson's lack of action curtailing black codes and his shocking veto of the Freedmen's Bureau extension that we discussed at the end of last episode, Republicans and Johnson began their road down a feud that would forever change the nation. In the early months of 1866, Senator Trumbull of Illinois introduced a civil rights bill which carried a similar sentiment to Wilson's that was rejected in December. The bill served to enhance the political and social conditions of blacks in the South and help tamp down the still increasing black codes. Wilson supported the bill and it passed through Congress, moving to the president's desk. Johnson, now being heavily criticized by the nation's leading Republicans, vetoed the bill, despite the objections of his cabinet, further destroying his relationship with Republicans. Congress, frustrated with the president, overrode his veto and passed the Civil Rights Bill. Wilson approached the impending conflict between Johnson and his colleagues cautiously. He knew it was vital to their cause to maintain a good relationship with the president, while others felt there was no hope in moving the stubborn man who had once been a friend of freedom. In an effort to curtail the president's ability to appoint who he wanted to cabinet offices, Senator Trumbull proposed an amendment to the Post Office Appropriations Bill of 1866 that would require the Senate to approve of all nominations the president made to an administrative office when Congress was in recess. Wilson, concerned with preserving some camaraderie with the president, voted against his Republican colleagues, believing that the amendment's only purpose was to spite the president and restrict his constitutional abilities. Wilson was attacked by his friends in the Senate for voting with the president, though Wilson argued he was voting with principle and believed the president's vetoes were disgraceful to not just the country but the entire continent. Trumbull asked, quote, "Has the senator from Massachusetts looked around the Senate and seen who is voting with him? He prefers to go with his enemies rather than his friends, does he?" End quote. Here again is Senate historian Betty Coed.
One of his biographers called him the practical radical, which I think is actually a good label for him because he was, in terms of his goals and his passions of legislation, he was certainly in the radical Republican camp. He was one of the strongest civil rights advocates we had in the Senate in the 1860s and 70s. But he was also someone who worked really hard behind the scenes to build coalitions and to make the compromises that were necessary to pass legislation. So he was radical in his politics, but he was very practical in his approach to legislation. And I think that practical radical is a good label for him.
Johnson had begun to not only do nothing about the South's discriminatory policies, but began to support them under the guise of states' rights.
Frederick Douglass is one of the first Black people to turn against Andrew Johnson, and he does that in a speech of September 1865. Up to that time, Black newspapers are okay with Johnson. They see him as promising. 1866, first week in February, Frederick Douglass meets with Andrew Johnson in the White House. And this is something I have a whole chapter about in my book, The Failed Promise. The idea was that Douglass would go there with about 10 other Black people and make the case for Blacks' rights to vote. And Andrew Johnson thought he would just kind of lecture them about his beliefs and they would just listen to him. And Douglass wouldn't let that happen. And Johnson, during the course of the meeting, reveals his clear racism. He even says that Blacks should consider immigrating, which was taken as, Blacks should leave the United States. And the kind of cool thing about this for me as a literary scholar is that Andrew Johnson brought to this meeting a stenographer who was very skilled in shorthand, had developed his own shorthand method. And that night, the entire discussion appeared in a Washington, D.C. newspaper. And then it was reprinted in newspapers throughout the country and in African-American newspapers. And suddenly, particularly in abolitionist and African-American newspapers, people were saying, this Andrew Johnson is horrible. And Douglass, in his 1881 autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, said that he believed that this meeting was crucial to the way, let's say the Northeast, I was going to say the nation, let's say the Northeast began to rethink who Johnson was. And what I argue in my book is that Douglass deliberately tried to get on Johnson's nerves, that this was kind of performance art on the part of Douglass, and that he succeeded. He drew Johnson out, and suddenly there's a revelation that this is who this person is. It's almost kind of like having a Confederate in office.
By August, the Republican Party convention, renamed to the National Union Party, met in Philadelphia and disowned Johnson from their organization. With 1866 being an election year and an important one for Congress, Wilson set off to push for support from the American people. Wilson, along with his Republican colleagues, campaigned directly against Johnson and argued the nation would only advance if Republicans had a strong enough hold on Congress to overrule the president. In April, another discussion began to swirl among Republicans regarding a new amendment to the Constitution. Wilson was central in the formation of what became the 14th Amendment and what that amendment could achieve. Republicans were passionate about securing citizenship to newly freed Blacks, who on a national level were not recognized. In addition to citizenship, Wilson and his colleagues wanted to strike a final blow at Southern Black codes.
Wilson plays a pretty important role in the 14th Amendment because he is one of the principal authors of what becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's the first civil rights bill to be introduced at the end of the Civil War. And it's a bill that is geared towards providing basic civil and voting rights to freed slaves, to African Americans in the U.S. And that piece of legislation in turn serves as sort of the foundation for what becomes the 14th and 15th Amendments. And so it's a lengthy process. It goes through many committees, and finally, as you know, it passes both houses of Congress, and then those get sent off to the states for ratification. But again, these individual players, Wilson and others, are really important because they gear the debate that shapes the language of those amendments, and that in turn shapes what becomes Reconstruction policy.
Some Republicans, like Senator Sumner, demanded that universal suffrage for males be added into the amendment. though Wilson felt the time had not yet come, and ensuring citizenship was a more important first step. Wilson knew that a suffrage bill was sure to fail, so it was best to stick with citizenship and equal protection before jumping the gun. Wilson served on a joint committee tasked with drafting the amendment. In June, the 14th Amendment passed Congress and went to the states for ratification. In addition to their clashes over the shaping of the 14th Amendment, Wilson and Sumner also faced tumultuous relations following the debate for admitting the new state of Colorado. Wilson was one of the leading senators in support of Colorado, primarily as it would add 2 new Republican senators to Congress, giving Republicans the edge to override Johnson's vetoes. Sumner was Republicans' leading opponent of admitting Colorado, as the state's proposed constitution failed to enfranchise black voters. Wilson, of course, rejected the lack of suffrage, though he realized the benefits of getting 2 more senators who would soon address that issue on a national level. Wilson's side would eventually win, and Colorado would be admitted as a state in August 1867. Wilson's pragmatism over suffrage would also soon see victory. The elections of 1866 pitted Republicans against Johnson, who opposed the 14th Amendment, making it a key policy of contention and campaigning. As the results came in November, it was clear that the people stood firmly with Republicans, as Wilson and his allies advanced their power in a landslide victory, shrinking Republican opposition in Congress. What this victory would mean for Johnson's fate was unclear, but Wilson was hopeful that the victory would produce meaningful progress for the advancement of equality. In addition to his work opposing Johnson and fighting for racial equality, Wilson also introduced and supported bills to improve public education. Wilson introduced a bill to provide Washington's schools with millions of improved acres of land, though much to Wilson's frustration, the bill failed. Not only was Wilson an advocate for better public schools for all races, so was Harriet, who advocated with other Senate wives to protect a black school just outside of Washington, meeting with President Johnson in 1867. While Wilson spent most of his 1866 fighting for the 14th Amendment, finished Reconstruction, and racial advancements, his personal life was met with a striking blow. Despite surviving the war at a post in Texas, Wilson's only son, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton, contracted a case of diphtheria on December 22nd, and 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, passed away at just 20 years old. Wilson was struck with grief beyond measure. Since his birth, Wilson adored his son, saying that he had no greater joy in life than being a father. Wilson learned of Hamilton's death upon arriving back home, finding his grief-stricken wife bedridden because of the news. The town of Natick closed all businesses on January 2nd to pay respect for the young boy's funeral services. The fort where Hamilton died in Austin, Texas, was named Fort Wilson in honor of Hamilton, before being renamed Fort Griffin after Union General Charles Griffin, who later served as the military governor of Texas and a leading figure in the Freedmen's Bureau before his death in 1867. Less than a year after Hamilton's death, in September 1867, Harriet would undergo surgery to remove a cancer, further hampering her already poor health. Despite his profound grief, it didn't take long for Wilson to return to work. With the strong results in the midterms, Wilson felt it was now the time to press for suffrage. As he had done with his emancipation efforts during the war, Wilson started small, supporting a bill to enfranchise the black people of Washington, D.C. While Wilson supported the bill, he opposed language that required reading and writing tests to be administered to gain access to the polls. Around this time, Wilson expressed his support for women's suffrage, though he felt associating it with black suffrage would lead to failure. Along with his advocacy for freed people, Wilson continued his lifelong work for the laborer. In the early months of 1867, Wilson supported an end to peonage, a form of labor which was used to pay off debts, similar to the indentured servitude he was subjected to as a child. Wilson was also a proponent of the 8-hour workday for government workers. As the nation approached nearly 2 years past the war's end, Wilson felt that the time for completing reunification and reconstruction with the South was now. Wilson supported reduced measures of loyalty from rebellious states to re-welcome them into the Union. Wilson wanted to bury the hatchet and focus on more pressing matters like suffrage for the freed people than continuing to bicker on how states should re-enter the Union. Wilson was charged by his opponents as being a conservative radical. Wilson supported the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The act, a part of a series of Reconstruction bills, divided the South into 5 military districts where soldiers would be used to enforce and uphold the rights guaranteed in the 13th, 14th, and later 15th Amendments. The use of the military was of utmost importance in securing black citizens their long-deprived rights.
Black Americans have different circumstances, different situations. So you have Frederick Douglass, who is meeting regularly with Black activists in Black conventions in places like Syracuse and actually throughout the Northeast. These are all well-educated Black people who were either freeborn or who had escaped from slavery prior to the Civil War. And they all wanted the Civil War to bring about Black citizenship and Black voting rights. Then you have a couple million free people in the South, many of whom were illiterate. And probably they would have loved citizenship and the right to vote. And when they got the right to vote, they did. But they were looking for education. They were looking for job opportunities. They probably weren't thinking about national politics in the way of someone like Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany. And they were highly dependent on the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the agency set up by Congress to help the freed people in the South. So there were these offices and bureaus throughout the South, and they offered legal advice, employment advice, advice on how to vote eventually. But a lot of these people, the several million people who were free people, were just trying to get by day by day in a very racist environment. And a lot of them ended up working on plantations for kind of for pay and kind of for not pay, because they would have to pay for the property and for the food that they would get when they were doing that kind of work. So you have millions of Black people who are struggling. You have Black activists like Douglass who are calling for full rights of citizenship.
Congress's use of the military strengthened their grip on the South and in steering Reconstruction to success. In an attempt to understand the mood of the South and gain more Southern support, Wilson took an unprecedented tour of the formerly rebellious states in April 1867. On his trip, Wilson spoke to crowds of thousands, discussing a sense of shared guilt for the war between the North and the South, inhibiting a spirit that, if nothing else would unify the nation, the shared experience of loss and destruction might. Wilson spoke about Republicans' power in Congress and pleaded with his Southern listeners that the best way to settle their disputes would be through following Congress's lead and supporting a package of civil rights. Wilson received support during his tour of the South, while some of his Northern colleagues criticized him for various reasons. Radicals felt he was not representing an accurate vision of Reconstruction, while those to the right accused him of stirring up too much hope for freedmen. As Wilson toured the South, his colleagues continued their ire towards the Johnson administration. In March 1867, Congress overrode Johnson's veto and passed the Tenure of Office Act, a bill that had been resurfaced from the first Congress in 1789 that had rejected it. The Tenure of Office Act required that the President obtain the consent of the Senate to remove any of their appointees. The Constitution requires the Senate approve of nominations by the President, but says nothing about their removal, a gap the 1867 Congress wanted to fill. The Radical Republicans passed the act to stop Johnson from removing Republican cabinet officials who had been appointed by Lincoln. Johnson maintained that the act was unconstitutional. Throughout the early half of 1867, congressional Republicans were fed up with Johnson and wanted to use their impeachment power to remove him from office.
There was talk about impeaching Andrew Johnson from the time he became president. So even when he was vice president, because he seemed to be drunk on the day that he was inaugurated as vice president. As the radicals got angry with him, they would keep coming up with these little measures to try to impeach him. Meanwhile, in March of 1867, which was a year before the impeachment, Congress passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which made it illegal and even impeachable for a president to remove a person from the cabinet who had been approved by the Senate. And eventually, the impeachment came about because Andrew Johnson fired Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, and that was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. So in a way, it was kind of like a trick, in a way, a kind of trick. Like, it's very difficult to impeach a president that you don't agree with. But if they actually break the law, and that was the law, then you can impeach him.
Johnson had attempted to remove Stanton while Congress was out of session and replace him with Ulysses Grant. Though unsure of the legality of this move and desiring to keep in good relations with the Republicans, Grant soon stepped down. Johnson, furious with his congressional opponents, appointed Major General Lorenzo Thomas, an adversary of Stanton, to fill the position, to which Stanton ordered Thomas's arrest for illegally taking his job. On the day of his firing, Wilson wrote to his longtime colleague and friend, quote, "I trust you will stand firm where you are, and we will stand by you." End quote. The Constitution gives Congress the power to impeach and remove the President, two separate but often conflated processes. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach a president by a majority vote. Once a president is impeached, the reasons for their impeachment, called the Articles of Impeachment, are sent to the Senate, where the fate of a president will be decided. The Senate holds a trial, and if convicted by a 2/3 vote, the president is removed. To put it simply, the House indicts the president, and the Senate can either decide to acquit or charge. Alleging the president violated the Tenure of Office Act, passed less than a year before, radical Republicans in the House passed the first presidential articles of impeachment in history in March 1868. The House passed 11 articles, all relating to Johnson's firing of Stanton, who had literally barricaded himself in his office. While the Tenure of Office Act was veiled as the reason for impeachment, Republicans were simply tired of fighting with the president and wanted him out of office. The law was based on unstable constitutional theory and had its opponents, including Edwin Stanton, though Republicans needed something to oust the despised president.
So what was really frustrating to Frederick Douglass and other Black people is that Andrew Johnson was not being impeached for his rejection or his stubborn refusal to go along with measures of Reconstruction. And so the material that's out there that you can find Frederick Douglass's son, Charles, attended the impeachment trial. Douglass didn't, for reasons I could talk about, but the son did, and he wrote him letters about what was happening. And Charles's position is that Johnson was responsible for the death of African Americans, that racist anger led to violence. And he should be impeached for that and for resisting Black voting rights and all that kind of thing. I think that's what Douglass believed as well. One Black newspaper complained that Johnson was being impeached over, and I'm going to quote, legal quibbles, end quote, not for fundamentally rejecting Reconstruction.
During the trial, Johnson's lawyers mounted a hefty defense against the radical Republicans' removal efforts.
The trial itself is just a sensation. I mean, it's sort of the big event of the year. The Senate chamber is just packed with people. It's packed with visitors every day, everyone coming to see the debates, to see the trial proceedings. And it becomes more of a show than anything else.
It seems Wilson knew the trial was based on politics, not principle, but had felt so fed up with the president that impeachment was the only means of achieving the radical Republicans' goals.
I would put Wilson in more of the skeptical side, not because he liked Andrew Johnson. By this time, he had come to really detest Andrew Johnson and I think was probably, it's hard to document this, but I would say he was probably in favor of the early impeachment efforts. But Wilson was very much a pragmatist, and he saw that the impeachment of the president and the removal of a president could be incredibly divisive. And as the Congress was working through this really difficult period of Reconstruction, he was looking for ways to mend relationships. He was looking for ways to form bonds that could help pass legislation. That was his basic goal. And with the radical Republicans really pushing on impeachment and removal of office, he saw that as a way that would undermine efforts to pass the important legislation that they had in mind. Not only the 15th Amendment, which was still under debate at this time, but also what would become the Civil Rights Act in the 1870 to 75 period that Sumner would push so hard to pass. And so it doesn't surprise me to hear that you're seeing these kind of mixed reactions, because even though he really opposed Johnson and did not like Johnson by this time period, his pragmatic side would come through. And he ultimately voted in favor of removal from office. He wasn't one of the 7 Republicans who supported Johnson and saved him from removal. But I think he did so with less vehemence than other radical Republicans.
In the end, despite having the majority in the Senate, Johnson's impeachment failed by just a single vote. Republican Senator Edmund Ross, who despite his disapproval of Johnson, voted with his principle against removal, feeling that a political impeachment would set a bad precedent. Wilson was one of the 35 senators who voted to remove Johnson. It seems Wilson was at first hesitant to support the impeachment under the guise of the tenure of office dispute, though he reasoned Johnson had violated the rights of men and was generally blocking the fulfillment of liberties supposedly endowed by the Constitution.
In the end, Johnson was not convicted, and he fell and the Republicans fell 1 vote short of getting him convicted. And I think there were probably some backdoor maneuverings that kept him in power, but that the Republicans probably felt that he was now kind of under their control. He just had a few more months left in office. They wanted Ulysses S. Grant to become president, which is what happened. If he had been convicted, someone else would have become president, not Grant. So the Republicans didn't want that. Douglass, after the trial, wrote a series of essays saying a couple things. The first is that this guy should have been convicted. And The second thing is that he thought the whole process was absurd, of focusing on something like the Tenure of Office Act. So he wanted to remind Americans of what the issues were.
The impeachment of Andrew Johnson had a lot of lasting effects. And one was this growing animosity between the Congress and the executive branch. This was the first time a president was impeached and the first time a president faced trial in the US Senate. And so it took a while to mend that relationship. But also for the Senate, it really emphasized the divisions within the Senate, not only between the North and the South of the Civil War era, or between the East and the West, which is becoming a growing division, but also within the parties themselves, the Republicans who supported impeachment and those who opposed impeachment. The few Democrats who were still in place at that time, most of them supported Johnson in the impeachment process. And so it just sort of divides the Senate in different ways and leaves it sort of fractured in 1868. It takes time for that to be built back up, and it takes time for those relationships to be built back up after that. But in the end, they saved Johnson, and Reconstruction continued on through the rest of the Johnson presidency, mostly on the terms of radical Republicans in Congress.
Though the radical Republicans' effort had been unsuccessful, they continued their drive against the president through the election of 1868. We covered a lot today, so let's run through it. First, we discussed the South's increasing black codes, Wilson's support of amnesty for former rebels, especially Jefferson Davis, the death of Wilson's son Hamilton, the further breakup between Johnson and the Republicans, the Reconstruction Acts, the 14th Amendment, and we ended on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. I apologize for this and coming episodes being so long, but there's just so much activity happening during this period. This was one of the most difficult episodes to put together, as choosing what to and what not to include was a frequent task. Thank you to my guests, Professor Robert S. Levine, author of The Failed Promise, U.S. Senate historian Betty Coed, and Wilson biographer John L. Myers. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're listening on. Check out HenryWilsonHistory.com for more information and for the newly added Henry Wilson and the Civil War store, where you can purchase stickers and support the show. If you have any questions, please shoot an email to HenryWilsonPodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll continue to discuss the era of Reconstruction.